It's a brave new world after the OTA with all new top decks. Let's take a look at the best decks in Marvel Snap. For the first time in ever, I can start the tier list with Zoo. I don't think you guys know how much this means to me. As someone who has been a Zoo coper for so long, I can confirm that many of the best players in the game, Tanjo, Yo Woody, Safety Blade, myself, are entirely zoo pilled. And it's really just a question of what the best build is for what you are trying to do. This deck is outputting points like nobody's business, and it is able to do so while customizing itself for the matchups that it sees. The build you see on screen comes from Yo Woody. It is built a little bit towards the mirror. Iceman, a very good card in the mirror. Kyera, a notable omission that is not very good in the mirror. The fact that this deck is able to also play a card as powerful as Shadow King, a really dangerous tech card at the moment, means that you can play around with that spot as well. I've tried Rogue, I've tried Red Guardian, I've seen people play Super Skrull. There's a lot of tech available to this deck. This deck is outputting a ton of points in a relatively predictable way, but not necessarily predictable enough to give you a legitimate advantage. Fundamentally, this deck is occupying a similar space to what Bounce normally occupies. The deck is just putting a bunch of numbers on the board. It has like one or two tech slots, but really what's happening is just number big as hell. And Zoo is undoubtedly, right now at least, an elite deck in Marvel Snap. Just to show what a bit more of a generalist build might look like, this is what I ended up on after messing around for a little bit. I was looking for a more general approach where the build previously was very like, okay, if they have Killmonger, I'm going to die. And one thing that I think is important to understand is that Killmonger is not the best counter to Zoo, Loki is, but if enough people stop playing Kyera, Killmonger will become the best counter to Zoo again. That's the other thing, though. I do expect there to be a lot of people who see a rise in Zoo and say, I need to play Killmonger. And that means that after a certain point, maybe teching against the mirror isn't the right way to do it, and you're going to need that Kyera to get back in the deck. That is generally just something to think about because I don't think Killmonger is the best way of beating Zoo because they do have tech against it, but it is a way of beating Zoo that people will try, and so if you're running into that, you should not feel afraid to play a Kyera build of the deck. So into this Zoo world, Brave Zoo world, I introduce this abomination. I saw a list of Loki on Untapped with like 50 games. Someone was playing the Blink in it. And I looked at that and I was like, wait, that's actually very clever. I took the list, I made a couple changes. I got the Elsa back in there, I got the Jeff back in there. And what I came to the conclusion of was I do think this is the right way to play the deck as long as Zoo is popular. Now, I'm not saying you have to play it this way. It's really sort of a concession to Zoo specifically. One of the things that really stuck out for me is every time I played against Zoo, if I played the card Loki, it didn't matter if that was on 4 or 5 because I'm a Quinjet deck, right? So what this deck is doing is using Blink to turn, for example, Agent Coulson into Loki on turn 5, and then you just dump your hand because they're playing Zoo, and you get a bunch of really good stuff. The theory here is basically, in a world where Loki is the best possible card against a very good deck, we want to be Lokiing as much as possible. This is not the kind of thing that's going to necessarily stick around. It is also not the kind of thing that you need to swear by, but it was by far my most successful deck this season because of the reliability of effectively having 2 Lokis in the deck. That's what the Blink is accomplishing here. She is 5/8 Loki, basically. And that's really good when the only thing that matters in like half the games you play, not just Zoo, other decks too, is are you going to play the card Loki? And so that is where this deck is at. The better Loki is, the more you want to invest in making sure the card Loki happens. This is not going to be true in every metagame. I want to be clear about that. In metagames that we've had previously, the card Loki hasn't been as good as its supporting cast. The supporting cast being like the Angela, Elsa stuff. Sometimes that's just better than Loki. In the current metagame, Loki is what allows that supporting cast to compete on points with a deck like Xunzz. That's why it's so important to be a Loki deck right now instead of playing a no-key style list. That is the theory that's going on here. One final note. I played Valentina. You don't have to play Valentina. She was just there. Play Cable, play Mirage. It's the same card. It's really not a big deal. You're gonna be fine to do it. One thing I did like about Valentina is she made me feel more rewarded for playing out my Quinjets, which normally I don't feel very rewarded for doing in games where I am so clearly like, if I play against Xunzz, I'm gonna fill the board up and then I'm gonna feel like, oh man, that's a 2 that, like, I feel bad about that. I could probably do better than 2 points in that lane. She makes me feel rewarded for that, and that's really all that I got out of her. I think the rest of this, like, you can play most Loki decks and you will probably be fine. So it was brought to my attention as I was recording this. The person who originally figured this out was a player named Tendrils, 10 number drills. And they were just in my chat and they were like, whoa, you got my deck. And they were able to name the cards that I swapped out. So shout out to them. I guess it was their deck. I just yoinked it off of Untapped after coming to the conclusion that the only thing I wanted to do was play Loki against Xunzz. Now, if you don't want to be a Blink Loki gamer, it's fine. You can play normal Loki. There are like 75 different builds of this deck. Here is a generic one for you to take and customize. The slots that you can customize around are Athena can be whatever, Cable can be whatever, Hope Summers can be whatever, Shang-Chi can be whatever. The rest of this is pretty locked in, but you can really do whatever you want in this space. The current rank 1 gamer, whose name I am once again not going to attempt to pronounce, Xunzz, has been playing this Sera list, which is not super far off from lists I've seen like Avazord experimenting with. It's a very straightforward tech card Sera list with one really big card, that's the Ronin, and you kind of already know where this is going, right? Like, you are trying to remove your opponent's cards, and right now, the main utility of this list is things like Killmonger. You can do, like, a Killmonger under an Invisible Woman, Rogue the Chimera, stuff like that. Like, you have a lot of interactions for Xunzz, you are a generally good deck, but you are sort of suffering from 12-slot syndrome with what you're trying to target, and you are generally not at the highest level of power output. You're okay, but you're not at the highest level of power output. So I think what this deck relies on the most, to me, is the element of surprise, which Invisible Woman is able to deliver in spades. But Sera is a good deck for surprise plays anyway, right? Because you have the turn 6 of all turn 6s. You can do basically whatever you want. One other thing that I enjoy about this deck is it's one of the very few decks right now that is actually playing Mobius, and in a world where I think Loki is as good as it is, being a deck that plays Mobius and doesn't totally eat it to Xunzz is a reasonable position for you to want to be in. If you are a Cannonball Coper, there may be some hope for you yet. This Doc Ock-based mill list, like, we pretend it's a mill deck, but if we're being real, what it's doing is Doc Ock into Cannonball, and there are many configurations of supporting pieces that you can put alongside it. It doesn't have to be like Yondu, Zemo, Gladiator. It can be a variety of stuff. There's just no real consensus about what that supporting cast should be yet, and we're still sort of working on that. Again, this is only a few days after the patch dropped, so there's still a lot of ambiguity here. This is just the one I think I've seen the most, where people are just like, well, I know this used to work, so let's go try doing it again. And I think that's not necessarily a bad thing to do. I mean, like, Doc Ock Cannonball is Professor X Cannonball with more work. One of the major things that this deck has going for it is, with the amount of Ravonna decks kind of cratering, Nocturne is not nearly as prevalent as it is previously, so you end up in these situations where Magic gets to be totally uncontested. And one thing that really sticks out as well is the later you play Magic, the better she gets. A turn 5 Magic is very powerful. A Magic on the lane where the Nocturne is very powerful, to the point that I know there is at least one top gamer who is playing Snow Guard in Xunzz specifically so they can deal with the cards that are extending the game like Magic. So really just Magic, right? It's specifically to deal with that, so they don't want to end up relying on just Nocturne. To the surprise of very few people, I do believe that Sersi ends up as very core in whatever deck that's playing Annihilus that you decide to play. This is the Sersi Death list. I expect a lot of people to go to this looking for just the best Killmonger list, and we have entered the Killmonger portion of the tier list, where it's like, I think Loki is better at doing the thing that you think this deck is doing, which is beating Xunzz. This deck is having a mid-range game plan that goes alongside Killmonger, that plays a lot of good stuff. I just think it's more appropriate to be Lokiing Xunzz than doing this. And I do think this is very powerful, to be clear. And I think in a world where Annihilus Sentry stuff is the metagame, this ends up being the best Annihilus Sentry list. It is the one that is the best in the mirror. It is very good at dealing with the things that other Annihilus Sentry lists can throw at it, but it is not currently an Annihilus Sentry meta, and so it is a little bit less useful than it would be in that context. Now, what this deck is mostly trying to do is large women. You're going to drop large women on your opponent, whether they be Mockingbird, whether they be Sersi, whether they be Death herself. Your goal is large women. Your deck is set up to facilitate this. Mockingbird, of course, working with Mysterio and with Sersi. Death, of course, going with your Killmonger Squirrel Girl plan. You got a lot of things going for what this deck is trying to get done. And part of what makes it such a powerful force in Annihilus Mirrors is the inclusion of not just Sersi to deal with that if you end up getting Annihilus, but also Carnage to help clean you up. This is the anti-Annihilus build, so if you are running into a lot of Annihilus, it is a very, very fine choice. One other option for Annihilus builds, and I think this one is, again, it's a little bit more generalist. It's more just straightforward. Good cards, interaction, powerful things, less combo-y, less focused on a specific matchup, more just focused on being good into a variety of things. This is a build I believe Revis came up with, and Yo Woody put me on to, where it was like, this is a strong way to play the deck right now. The main role Sersi has in Annihilus decks is being that second Annihilus, being able to get rid of that void and turn it into a good thing. That's a very powerful thing to do. You're going to see a lot of this package. I expect the sort of Mysterio, Mockingbird, Annihilus, Sentry, Sersi group of cards. They're kind of going to be doing a lot of things together, and it's more about the supporting cast for what you're doing with those things. And I think that this is a perfectly cromulent way to approach the metagame. Just say, I'm going to take a deck that has a lot of good cards in it, has a lot of good synergy in it, and try to just win games by playing good cards on curve with synergy. Let's get a bunch of points on the board. Let's go. Silver Surfer might actually just be the best of the Killmonger decks because it is such a solid deck outside of being a Killmonger deck. The other Killmonger decks destroy the Death version of the Sersi list are Killmonger decks, but they're like, okay, if I don't get the Killmonger off, or if they like Kyera me, it's very bad. This deck, I think the real thing that sticks out to me is it has Red Guardian, which means you can turn off a Kyera, you can turn off a Blue Marvel, you can do stuff to make sure your Killmonger hits. And I think that tends to be pretty important in those matchups. I know I have lost to Surfer while playing Xunzz because of that exact thing. They snap, and then 2 turns later, it turns out what they're snapping on is Red Guardian, my Kyera, and I have Killmonger. That kind of stuff does happen, and it does matter, and if you're playing Xunzz, you're going to want to try to play around it. I was caught totally off guard. And so this list, just a very straightforward, good, approachable, solid Killmonger list. It's also got the mild upside of not being the greatest list to play Loki into, especially when your Loki list is so Loki heavy as the Blink one I was playing. It's like, you know, there are some good hits off Loki, but there is just enough finicky stuff in here that it's like, if I Loki stuff, I might not be able to really do a lot with it compared to what you do as the player of Silver Surfer. Like, you are very much able to be competitive with a Loki because of the extra energy you get from Hope Summers, but also because you have the entire game to get a Silver Surfer and set up for a Silver Surfer. The Loki player has like 1 or 2 turns. And so that means that you are usually better at playing your own deck than they are. Hela is still a deck, and I think the debate is over at this point. We are meant to be playing Corvus Glaive now in Hela. We are no longer able to make the sacrifices like playing Colleen Wing and trying to get power that way. The nerf to her has forced us back onto Corvus Glaive, Black Knight. We just got to do what we got to do. It's not my favorite thing in the world. It really isn't. I mean, I do think that it's good that Hela is an approachable, like, series, series 3-ish kind of deck. But here's what happened is now Hela has to run Corvus in order to have the requisite explosiveness to keep up with the rest of the meta. And it probably wants to run Black Knight, and neither of those are free. And so it's like, I almost feel like the deck got a little bit less free to play. It got a little worse. And the main thing that sticks out to me about how Hela plays right now is not that it's bad. It's actually, you're still going to beat the crap out of Loki. You're going to ruin a Loki player's day. That's always a good thing. But you end up in these spots against other decks, Zoo especially, where it's like, if this was a few days ago, I would win this game for sure on the Hela. But now suddenly it's like, okay, the Zoo player has like 20, 20, and 20. And unless I discarded the Infinaut, I'm kind of just like, oh, wait, they actually just have more points than me most of the permutations here. And I think that is really noticeable because one of the major things that Hela got a lot of cubes out of was her superpower of people cope staying into her. And now more of those cope stays are right than they are wrong. And that means that she got hit basically right in the superpower. Her superpower was people would stay in these unwinnable games, but now they actually are kind of winnable, and that's a really bad place to get hit. I think this deck is still good, and you're still going to be able to ruin Loki gamers' days, but the overall power here, like, Zoo is competitive with you. Annihilus stuff is competitive with you. And when those decks are not instantly losing to you, it becomes a lot harder for me to want to play this deck. In the absence, quote unquote, of Hela, people have been trying Phoenix Force to sort of fill that, combo spot in the metagame. And it is good. Like, this is a deck that can do what you want it to do. It is fundamentally a bit less consistent than Hela, but when it happens, your snaps are very clear, your power is very clear. The only issue I can see for this deck is your power is very often highly telegraphed. And what I mean by that is you have a bunch of 8s in every lane, right? So God forbid they Shadow King one lane and Gilgamesh another, you're kind of going to die, right? Like, you can get to, it's usually like 24 plus a Ghost Spider, so 26. You're very rarely at like 32s in these lanes. It's possible. Like, don't get me wrong, it's super possible. And I think secondarily, like, we have this backup plan of like Shuri and Zola and Nimrod and all of that. And again, it's fine. But the same issue with Hela applies, where these decks that are doing positive numbers like Zoo and Annihilus, like, those numbers are quite large. And I think you will mostly still beat them, but it is a little bit closer than it used to be, especially when you're on your backup plan here. Unless you're Omega popping off with like 12 power Nimrods going everywhere, there are going to be games where you can actually just lose even when you pull this stuff off. And that makes these kind of combo decks feel like a bit of an awkward proposition to me. Now, I know a lot of other people have been playing a lot of other PF decks, but if I'm going to be 100% honest, I am just not sold on any of them. I'm not sold on the Deadpool stuff. I'm not sold on the Hulkbuster stuff. I am sold on we have a functional game plan. And so that is why this build of PF is the one on the tier list. Honorable mention, Namora. Still kind of a good deck, but a lot of the power of this deck was being a good deck into Professor stuff. One thing I think this deck does have that other decks simply don't is sometimes you just instantly win. Like a Wong into Tiger into Odin kind of thing is disgusting. A Wong Sage is always going to win the Wong lane, basically. You have a lot of power in here and like some really solid final turn mix-ups where your opponent has to figure out what's actually happening on the Wong lane. Are you going to be Odining for 1,000,000 points? Are you going to be saging? Are you going to be sending tigers everywhere? What's actually happening? And that mix-up of being able to either target every lane but the Wong lane with White Tiger or target the Wong lane very heavily with Sage makes this deck just really hard to play against. And that is to say nothing of like the giant Namora Jeffs that this deck can create. Like, it is very powerful. Another thing this deck has going for it is it has an Echo in it in order to prevent from being Cosmoed in your Wong lane. That Echo's actually just pretty good when people are playing Zoo. Like, people are playing Zoo, you can echo them. There's some upside there. Honorable mention to Destroy, which is, as far as I am concerned, just like the most mediocre but playable deck that exists. I am afraid that a bunch of people will see this tier list and be like, Zoo is good, let's play Destroy. Oh, the hot location is cloning vats, and that's kind of the only situation I'd really recommend playing Destroy. It's fine, but it's sort of just a hard to justify deck when the power of other decks in the same space is as high as it is. So what this build is trying to do, Destroy has one tech slot, it's Arnim Zola, so our tech slot here is built at going as tall as we possibly can for those games against Zoo where we don't actually have the Killmonger or they Kyera us. Maybe we can still, Giant Null, Giant Venom, get their ass, right? But there's just kind of a lot of Shadow King, so when you invest in Giant Venom, you're just like, okay, guess I die when they Shadow King you. And unless you're really popping off either with Deadpool Hulkbuster or with a Killmonger on a lot of Zoo's stuff, it just doesn't feel like this is a necessarily reliable way of actually beating them. It's the kind of thing that lines up better in theory than in practice. And when you play it against other things, it's like, it really feels like unless you are really, really popping off, the deck is not up to par. Now, when it is popping off, it is beyond up to par. This is a deck that is so completely absurd when it does what it wants to do, but it's so telegraphed when it does what it wants to do. So you end up having poor cube equity. Your opponents know what's going to happen. They're only going to stay when they beat what you're doing. And I think that's a really rough spot for a deck to be in if it's not super insanely dominant the way something like Profex Cannonball was. Honorable mention here, Geo sent over a Bounce Sersi Annihilus list, and it's even playing the Grandmaster. Now, I think that this is less of a true bounce list and more of a deck that is closer in kinship to the other Sersi Annihilus lists that we've shown here. Yes, you are using Werewolf by Night as your stat stick. That's a very powerful thing to do as well. But really, this is just taking the same Sersi Annihilus package and saying, I would like a different early game shell for it, using these cards in confusing ways to make your opponent feel like they don't know what's going to happen. There's a lot of surprise value to this list. I'll be interested to see if it manages to hold up. I think it's a very solid, I'm going to surprise you type deck, but I do worry that putting it in a video like this, making it so clear what's actually in the deck, is gonna make it less of a good surprise. One thing I especially want to highlight, though, is that there are absolutely games where you can win by doing Sage Grandmaster or Shadow King Grandmaster. Stuff like that is really strong and really unexpected. Honorable mention to the Thor Wombo Combo deck. It has some of the worst draws I've ever seen and some of the best draws I've ever seen. The reason this is moving down to honorable mention after I put it in my initial day one decks is the prevalence of Shadow King means that this deck is a little bit awkward to actually try to manage. In a world where your opponent is able to throw priority, like the Xunzz Sera deck, or a lot of other decks with Shadow King actually, then you are going to end up in scenarios where everything you're investing in, everything you've worked for, gets erased at the hands of Amal Farouk. And that's not a great situation to be in, so this deck ends up feeling like it's pretty okay, but it has a very pronounced weakness to Shadow King. One thing that I really do like about it and other Pixie decks, though, is just being a deck that plays Pixie Mobius makes you feel good into Loki. There's so few things that actually feel good into Loki in the context of what the current metagame looks like. Last metagame had a ton of stuff that felt great into Loki. This metagame is shaping up to be a little more Loki heavy, and that means that there is something to be done in the Pixie Mobius shell. I'm nearly positive about it. We've got a new tier on the tier list. This is Tier Pain. It's decks that you are going to see and people can play, but I only recommend doing that if you love pain. The first one of these is Negative Tribunal. You know what this deck is, and you know what this deck does. You are going to try to drop the most points of all time on your opponent's head in the most telegraphed way of all time. It's fine. you can try it. There are a bunch of free matchups, and then sometimes you just instantly die to, like, your deck not working or your opponent having a piece of interaction. And I think another thing that really counts against this deck in my eyes is there is a lot of ongoing zoo in the metagame right now, right? And because there's so much zoo, there are people who are playing Rogue. There are people who are playing Enchantress. There are people who are playing Red Guardian. And it's like, you kind of eat it to a lot of that stuff. So this deck is catching splash damage from the prevalence of zoo. Finally, in the pain tier, the Reddit.com Galactus deck. I play against this sometimes. Typically what happens is once you know what they're trying to do, it becomes pretty easy to beat them. They're typically aiming for either your Galactus game plan, or alternatively, they're going to play a wave into an Ultron, Killmonger the Ultron, play a free death, play something alongside the free death. That's the other thing they kind of do. It's something. Like, it's not necessarily... I think as far as decks that started on Reddit, it's probably the best one. But I don't know if that's a very deep pool of decks. So it's not necessarily, like, it might be damning with faint praise here, but it is a deck people play. It is a strong enough deck that it will win games against people who don't know what they're doing. And I kind of like that it's around. I'm not going to lie to you. I think it's funny and fun and cool, and not at all something I would recommend for anyone wanting to climb the ladder. All right, y'all, thank you so much for making it through that video. You can always catch more from me on this channel and on Twitch. Please do remember to subscribe, click that like button. I really appreciate when people do that. I genuinely do. Thank you so much. As always, I have been KMBest. You have been phenomenal. Enjoy the KM Boost, and I will see you in the next one.